"I'm sorry, sir, but we don't serve walk-ins in sneakers." That's what Malcolm Reed heard, loud enough for the entire dining room to pause. He stood there, calm and composed, in the middle of a restaurant he personally built. The floor manager didn't recognize him. She didn't know she had just denied service to the man whose signature approved her paycheck every 2 weeks. But he didn't correct her. He didn't raise his voice. He just reached for his phone. And 7 minutes later, $420 million in ESG-backed funding across 12 luxury restaurant brands was frozen. 3 hours earlier. Charleston's heat was already kicking in as Malcolm stepped out of his black Audi e-tron and onto the stone-paved sidewalk of King Street. He wore a navy pullover, khaki chinos, and a pair of gray New Balance sneakers, the uniform of a man who had nothing to prove. His salt and pepper beard was trimmed close, his posture relaxed, his phone silent. This wasn't a scheduled visit. No press, no executive assistant. He didn't want anyone to know he was here. He was here for a simple reason: to see the truth. Lorraine was one of Viridian Table Group's newest flagship locations, a refined Southern European fusion experience, as the branding called it. And today, Malcolm wanted to experience it through the eyes of a regular customer. No titles, no red carpet, just one man walking in from the street. And apparently, that was already too much. The moment he stepped through the tall glass doors, he felt it. That slight hesitation in the air, not the sound of silence, the sound of silent judgment, the kind you don't hear, but feel. A hostess glanced up from her podium, took one look at his sneakers, and immediately dropped her smile. Her name tag said Claire. Her body language said, "You don't belong here." Malcolm smiled anyway. "Hi there. Just wondering if I could get a seat for one. Anywhere's fine. No reservation." Claire didn't even glance at the seating chart. "Unfortunately, we're fully committed today, sir." Malcolm nodded politely. "Even at the bar?" Before she could answer, a voice rang out from behind her, sharp, clipped, authoritative. "I'll handle this." A tall woman in heels and a sleek black blouse strode over. Her name tag read, Amanda D., floor manager. Her expression was professional, but her eyes carried something else. Malcolm had seen that look before, in boardrooms, in luxury stores, in hotel lobbies. The quick scan, the sizing up, the subtle calculation. Do you fit here? Are you part of this world? Amanda didn't wait for him to speak. "We don't accept walk-ins during peak hours," she said briskly, "especially not out of dress code." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Dress code?" She gestured, subtle but unmistakable, at his shoes. "We ask our guests to maintain a certain standard of attire. This is not a casual establishment." Malcolm glanced down at his outfit. Clean, neat, presentable, but not designer, which was the point. Amanda continued, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "You might want to try the wharf down the street. They're more flexible." A couple at a nearby table, a well-dressed, older white couple, watched with amusement. The woman leaned toward her husband and whispered something with a chuckle. The words didn't sting. Not really. But they confirmed what Malcolm already knew. This place might look beautiful, but its soul was rotting. "I see," he said softly. Amanda crossed her arms. "This is a curated experience, sir. Our guests expect a certain environment." Malcolm's voice didn't rise. "And that environment doesn't include people who look like me?" Amanda froze for a beat. "Excuse me?" "I said I understand," Malcolm replied calmly. "I'll leave you to your curated experience." From across the floor, Javier Morales, a young busser in his first month on the job, watched in stunned silence. He'd heard whispers about the owner of Viridian Table, some legendary black executive who'd built the company from scratch, fought his way into an elitist culinary industry, and reshaped it from the inside. He didn't know what Malcolm Reed looked like, but something about the quiet dignity of this man. It didn't fit the image Amanda was painting. Something was off. Malcolm stepped outside, walked calmly back to his car, and got in. He didn't sigh. He didn't curse. He just unlocked his phone, opened an encrypted portal, and typed one line. Activate Code 21, Charleston Node. Suspend Viridian Ethics Clearance. Notify all ESG partners. Then he hit send. Inside Lorraine, Amanda returned to the hostess stand with a smug smile. He probably wandered in from the wharf, she quipped to Claire, who rolled her eyes. People always think money gets them anywhere. Neither of them noticed Javier frozen in place, his hands gripping a tray so tightly his knuckles went white. He didn't say a word, but he was watching and remembering. 7 minutes later, a cascade of system alerts began pouring into dashboards around the world. 12 restaurant brands in 3 countries had their Gastroethica Core certifications suspended. $420 million in ESG-linked capital investment was automatically frozen pending internal review. 3 major international food and wine festivals delisted those restaurants, citing ethical non-compliance. Global media outlets began receiving embargoed statements marked urgent, ethics violation pending disclosure, and none of them knew that it had all started with one man in sneakers. Back in his car, Malcolm looked at a photo pinned in the dashboard. His mother, standing in front of a tiny diner she worked at for 28 years. The caption he had written years ago still rang in his head. She fed people with love, not labels. Malcolm had built Viridian to rewrite the script of who gets to belong in luxury. But somewhere along the way, the machine had forgotten its mission. Now, he was going to remind them, quietly, powerfully, and with no need to raise his voice. Javier Morales had never seen anyone leave that quietly before. In his 3 weeks working at Lorraine, he'd seen couples throw fits because their wine wasn't room temperature. One man nearly flipped a table because the oysters weren't from the right side of the bay. And God forbid you got someone's truffle butter timing wrong. They acted like you'd insulted their bloodline. But that man, Malcolm, he didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't beg. He just left, and that silence felt heavier than any screaming match Javier had ever seen in this place. Javier kept resetting cutlery on a corner table, trying to keep his hands busy, but he couldn't stop replaying the moment in his head. The manager, Amanda, had spoken down to that man like he was some tourist who stumbled in from the wrong zip code. Yet something about him didn't match the way she treated him. The calm in his voice, the precision in his movements, the way he stood up taller instead of shrinking back. Javier didn't know his name, but he felt it in his gut. That man wasn't ordinary. And something told him Amanda had just made the biggest mistake of her career. 30 minutes passed. Amanda returned to her normal rhythm, bossing the staff around and tossing compliments to VIP tables like rose petals. Claire, the hostess, had already forgotten the scene, smiling wide as she escorted another well-dressed couple to the window seats. But Javier couldn't let it go. He whispered to a server beside him, "Hey, did you recognize that guy Amanda kicked out?" The server shrugged. "Just some walk-in, no reservation." "No," Javier said slowly. "I think he was someone." The server rolled his eyes. If he was someone, he'd be back already, with lawyers. Outside, the sun began dipping lower across the Charleston rooftops. Golden light spilled through the tall windows of Lorraine, making the polished brass gleam. Then the door opened. No one noticed at first, just another suited guest, right? But then there were 3 more. Then 2 women with leather briefcases. One of them wore a name badge that simply said Gastroethica Protocol Division. And then he walked in. Malcolm. Not in sneakers this time. He wore a charcoal suit, perfectly tailored, with a crisp white shirt and cufflinks so subtle they almost disappeared. His walk was unhurried, but there was gravity in his step. Like the floor shifted slightly beneath him with each stride. He didn't look angry. He looked resolved. Amanda spotted him halfway through the room. Her face twisted for a second. Recognition, then confusion, then discomfort. She started toward him. "Sir, we spoke earlier. If there's a misunderstanding..." But Malcolm didn't stop. He simply turned toward the center of the restaurant and said clearly, "May I have everyone's attention, please?" The entire dining room froze. Glasses paused mid-air. Conversations silenced themselves. Even the kitchen seemed to go quiet. Amanda stood beside him, visibly shaken now. "Sir, if you could step outside, we can discuss this." "You had your chance to speak earlier," Malcolm said, turning to face her. "Now it's my turn." Behind him, one of the women from the Gastroethica delegation opened a tablet and began pulling up documents. Another handed Malcolm a sealed envelope. "My name is Malcolm Reed. I am the founder and CEO of Viridian Table Group. I am also the final certifier of the Gastroethica core system, which evaluates the ethical eligibility of food and hospitality brands for ESG-aligned funding and global recognition." You could hear someone gasp in the back of the room. Amanda blinked rapidly. "What? I don't understand." Malcolm didn't blink. "This restaurant and 11 others in its investment group have just been downgraded to non-compliant status. Effective immediately, $420 million in ESG-aligned funding has been frozen, and your eligibility for all upcoming culinary partnerships, sponsorships, and awards has been revoked." Another gasp. Then a fork clattered to the floor. Malcolm looked around the room, making eye contact with guests, some ashamed, some stunned, some wide-eyed with disbelief. "This morning," he continued, "I walked in here not as a CEO, not as your benefactor, but as a customer, and I was turned away. Not because I was rude, not because there were no seats, but because someone decided I didn't look like I belonged." Amanda's voice finally cracked. "This isn't fair. I was just enforcing policy." "No," Malcolm said, cutting her off. "You were enforcing bias, dressed up as policy, and you weren't just disrespecting a man, you were violating the very standard this restaurant claimed to represent." He handed the envelope to her. "This is your termination notice, effective immediately." Amanda's mouth hung open. "You can't be serious." "I'm being generous," Malcolm said, his voice low. "This could have been a scandal. Instead, it's going to be a lesson." He turned to the Gastroethica officer. "Begin internal audit protocol." Across the room, Javier stood frozen. His heart was pounding. It was him. The man Amanda humiliated that morning. The man who left quietly, only to return with an army of consequences. He watched as Amanda gathered her things under the eyes of her now silent staff. No more fake smiles. No more smug orders. Just a woman unraveling under the weight of her own ignorance. As she passed by, she avoided Malcolm's eyes. He didn't stop her. He didn't need to. The head of Viridian's ethics division stepped forward. "Mr. Reed, would you like to appoint an interim manager until the audit is complete?" Malcolm scanned the staff. Some wouldn't meet his eyes. Some looked terrified. But one face stood out. Javier. He wasn't dressed for power, but he had seen what happened. He had felt it, and he hadn't laughed. He hadn't looked away. Malcolm walked over. "What's your name?" he asked. Javier Morales." "How long you been here?" 3 weeks, sir." Malcolm nodded. "I watched you. You noticed something was wrong today, and you didn't join in. You kept your head." Javier swallowed hard. "I didn't know who you were." "You didn't need to," Malcolm said. "You just needed to know what respect looked like." He turned to the ethics officer. "Until further notice, Javier's running the floor. I'll send a full training team this week." Javier's eyes went wide. "Wait, me? I'm just a busser." "Not anymore." Malcolm turned back to the diners. Some looked ashamed. Others looked humbled. A few even clapped quietly. "Hospitality is not just service," he said. "It's dignity, and dignity is not negotiable." Then he walked out. No music, no applause, just stunned silence, broken only by the sound of a single guest whispering to their spouse, "I think we all just witnessed a reckoning." Javier Morales still hadn't moved. The restaurant had emptied out slowly after Malcolm Reed's announcement, but he remained standing near the service station, frozen with a clean towel still draped over one shoulder. He kept waiting for someone to tell him it was a mistake, that this was some elaborate joke, that at any second, Amanda would reappear and bark at him to refill water glasses or clear table 8 like she had every day since he started. But she didn't, because Amanda was gone, and somehow, he was the one still standing. The dining room felt surreal in the aftermath, like a stage after the audience had left. Half the staff had disappeared into the back, whispering, pretending to look busy. Some were already on their phones, probably texting other restaurants. Claire, the hostess who had laughed earlier, now avoided eye contact like it burned. And then there was Malcolm. Still there, still calm. Standing by the reception desk, reviewing something on a tablet with one of the gastroethica officers. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't strut. But he carried himself like the room belonged to him, even without saying so. And the truth was, it did. "Javier," Malcolm said, turning toward him. Javier straightened like he was reporting to a general. "Yes, sir." "I'd like you to stay." Javier blinked. "Stay? I'm going to need someone to help reorient this space. You're not just here to bus tables anymore." Javier glanced around nervously. "Sir, I don't know how to run a restaurant." "You don't need to," Malcolm said. "Not yet. You need to help me rebuild the bones first." Javier's voice lowered. "Why me?" Malcolm studied him for a beat, then said quietly, "Because you saw what happened, and you didn't look away." By that evening, word had already begun to spread. Food blogs, industry WhatsApp groups, private equity chat threads. Charleston flagship of Viridian table suspended. Gastroethica Core initiates rare Level 2 audit. CEO Malcolm Reed appears unannounced, terminates floor manager on site. Most people didn't believe it. Until the second wave hit. 12 restaurants, across 3 countries, all downgraded from certified compliant to pending review. ESG funding suspended. Michelin and James Beard partner orgs pulled back endorsement deals. 2 wine brands canceled showcase appearances at international festivals. By 9:30 p.m., a tweet from a food journalist confirmed it. Sources say Malcolm Reed personally invoked Code 21, a system-level suspension across ethics layers, industry scrambling. Meanwhile, back at the restaurant, Malcolm walked Javier through the dining room like a quiet professor reviewing the ruins of a broken temple. "This marble," Malcolm said, tapping the floor beneath them. "Imported from a quarry in Italy. Took 6 months to get here, but the people walking on it, some of them still don't feel welcome." Javier swallowed. "I always thought this place was beautiful." "It is," Malcolm said. "But beauty doesn't equal dignity." They paused by the bar. A server walked by quickly without making eye contact. Malcolm didn't react. "The culture here is built on exclusivity. I'm not talking about luxury food. I'm talking about invisible gates, language, tone, who gets attention, who gets ignored." "I've seen that," Javier admitted. "Guests who wear certain brands get eye contact. Others get tolerated." "And that," Malcolm said, "is how discrimination survives, behind politeness and policy." They reached the kitchen. Chef Alain, the French executive chef, stood with folded arms and pursed lips, his white coat spotless, his tone clipped. "Mr. Reed," he said, "I must admit I was surprised by today's disruption." Malcolm smiled faintly. Disruption is often mistaken for correction. Alain didn't flinch. "You're questioning my team's integrity. I'm questioning the foundation we built that allowed this to happen under your nose." Alain's jaw tightened. "My staff follows protocol." "Amanda followed protocol," Malcolm said, "and she's now unemployed." Alain fell silent. Javier stood nearby, heart pounding. It felt like 2 titans negotiating the fate of the restaurant, and maybe the whole group. "Chef," Malcolm said, lowering his voice but not his intensity, "your food has always been exceptional. That's why I invested in you. But if the culture you allow turns away people based on how they look, we're not serving anything but ego." There was a long pause. Then Alain said slowly, "What do you intend to do next?" "Rebuild the experience, from the floorboards up." The next morning, the real storm hit. A major ESG fund, Equia Capital, officially paused all future rounds of investment in Viridian-aligned restaurants until the audit completed. That meant tens of millions in growth capital dried up overnight. A board member from New York called Malcolm personally. "You need to release a statement. Clarify. This makes us look unstable." Malcolm responded calmly. "If it makes bigots nervous to invest, then it's working." Back in Charleston, Javier returned for his first day as interim floor lead. He arrived early, nervous, dressed in slacks and a pressed white shirt someone from the back office had found for him. He expected resistance, cold shoulders, passive-aggressive snubs. Instead, something stranger happened. People listened. Maybe it was because Malcolm had been so public with his words. Maybe it was because they didn't know if they'd be next. Or maybe for the first time they saw someone being promoted for character, not politics. Claire, the hostess, greeted him awkwardly. "Morning," she mumbled. "Morning," Javier replied. No sarcasm, just grace. He wasn't here to punish anyone. He was here to reset the tone. Later that afternoon, as Malcolm reviewed some final compliance documents upstairs, he received a knock on his office door. It was Javier. "Sir, do you have a moment?" Malcolm looked up. "Of course." Javier stepped in, holding a worn journal in his hands. "I wanted to show you something," he said. "My mom gave me this when I graduated high school, told me to write down what kind of man I wanted to be." He opened it. On the first page, in faded ink, it read, "Make people feel welcome, especially when the world tells them they shouldn't be." Malcolm read it, then looked up. "That's the entire mission statement I've been trying to write for 20 years, he said. They both smiled. That night, as the sun dipped low over the Charleston harbor, Lorraine reopened, quietly, intentionally, and without fanfare. No press, no launch party. Just new policies on the wall, revised service protocols, and staff briefings that began with a single phrase: "Every guest deserves dignity," before they ever touch the menu. A few guests returned, some familiar, some new. One was a black woman in her 70s wearing a Sunday church dress and a broad-brimmed hat. She ordered the tasting menu, ate slowly, and looked around like she had never been allowed to sit in a space like this before without someone watching her. Javier approached to check in. "Everything to your liking, ma'am?" She looked at him, really looked, and smiled. "Honey," she said, "this place used to feel like it wasn't for folks like me. But tonight it feels like the table was made for me." Javier smiled back. It was. 2 days had passed. From the outside, Lorraine looked exactly the same. Same white facade, same gold-trimmed windows, same velvet curtains that barely shifted in the breeze. But inside, everything had changed. The energy, the tension, the silence. Every employee felt it. It wasn't just that Amanda was gone. It was that the invisible rules had cracked. The hierarchy, built on silent judgments and quiet exclusions, no longer felt stable. And that scared people. Javier Morales now had a clipboard in his hand and a name tag that read Floor Coordinator. He still didn't know how to act like a manager, but he did know how to listen. He started the day with something no one had done at Lorraine before. He asked the staff how they felt. "Look," he told them in the prep area that morning, "I'm not here to punish anybody. I just want this place to feel like people matter, guests and workers." Some nodded. Some avoided eye contact. A few scoffed quietly. Chef Alain wasn't at that meeting. He never showed up to floor meetings. Upstairs, Malcolm Reed sat in a private office usually reserved for investors or food critics. But today, it was his war room. He reviewed a report from the Gastroethica compliance team. 23 minor infractions logged, 8 serious violations, 2 systemic behavior patterns flagged as sustained discriminatory bias. The system had spoken. The problem wasn't just Amanda. It was deeper, wider, and older. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning a photo on the shelf behind him. His mother again. She stood in her 1980s diner uniform, holding a tray of biscuits and gravy, smiling with that tired but unshakable pride that black women carried when no one clapped for them, but they cooked anyway. He could hear her voice now, same as ever. "Don't just fix what broke. figure out why it wasn't built right to begin with. He was still lost in thought when he heard a knock. "Come in." Javier entered, slightly breathless. "Mr. Reed, sorry to bother you. Chef Alain wants to speak with you, in private." Malcolm closed the file on his desk and stood. "All right," he said. "Let's finish what we started." They met in the wine room. Quiet, cool, lined with bottles worth more than most mortgages. The room was designed for exclusivity, and Alain stood like he belonged there. "Mr. Reed," he said, polite but icy. "I understand you've taken over operations." "For now," Malcolm replied. "You've made a lot of changes in very little time. I'm not here to waste time." Alain exhaled slowly. "You're disrupting a system that has worked at the highest level of fine dining for decades." Malcolm folded his arms. "And who, exactly, has it worked for?" Alain looked at him, unsure if it was rhetorical. Malcolm continued. "It's worked for the people who knew which fork to use, who wore the right watch, who looked like they belonged before they even sat down. You call that excellence. I call it exclusion wrapped in linen." Alain's voice hardened. "Hospitality is about standards." Malcolm's voice never rose, but his words cut sharper. "So is justice." There was silence between them, long and loaded. Then Malcolm said quietly, "I'm not here to destroy you, Chef. I'm here to force this place to live up to its potential, to serve more than just the same polished few. Can you lead that kind of kitchen?" Alain didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, "That depends on who you trust to stand beside me." Back on the floor, Javier watched as staff slowly began to fall into new rhythms. He'd moved the reception desk closer to the front door so guests were greeted sooner. He'd changed how tables were assigned, no longer based on who looked important. And when a couple came in wearing casual clothes, no one flinched anymore. It was small, but it was real. At 6:05 p.m., a couple walked in without a reservation. They were black, maybe in their late 50s. He wore a linen blazer and loafers. She wore a sunflower yellow dress and a broad-brimmed hat. They both hesitated at the entrance. Javier greeted them first. "Welcome to Lorraine. Table for two?" The woman smiled cautiously. "You sure?" He nodded. "We're always sure about treating people right." She touched his hand lightly as she passed. "It's been a long time since I've heard that from someone in a place like this." They were seated by the window, served champagne, not judgment. Upstairs, Malcolm returned to his desk, where a call was waiting from Amelia Blackstone, one of Viridian's ESG fund board partners. "I heard about Code 21, she said. "We've never seen you pull it on your own flagship before." "Now you have," Malcolm said. Amelia exhaled. "You're going to get blowback." "Good. You really going to let that boy run your floor?" Malcolm didn't answer immediately. Then, with the cool confidence only he could carry, he said, "He's not a boy. He's a man who didn't look away. And that's more leadership than I've seen from some people in $1,000 suits." That night, as the final dinner guests left, Javier walked through the dining room, quietly resetting candles on each table. Malcolm entered from the side. "Not bad for your first full day," he said. Javier looked up, tired but proud. "Still made a few mistakes." Malcolm smiled. "The only mistake I worry about is if you stop seeing people." "I don't think I could," Javier said. "Not after this week." Malcolm nodded. "Good. Because this place, it was built to be beautiful. Now, we make it honest." As they stood in silence, a faint sound echoed through the space. Applause. They turned toward the bar. It was the black couple in the yellow dress and linen jacket, now standing with a group of 3 other couples, all clapping quietly. No fanfare, no announcements. Just people who saw the change and felt it. It had been 1 week. 1 week since the incident. 1 week since Amanda was walked out. 1 week since the restaurant's name showed up on industry news feeds, Twitter threads, and ESG compliance reports across 3 continents. Inside Lorraine, things were quieter. Not dead, not panicked, just quieter. like everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see if the change was real or just temporary theater. Javier Morales now opened every shift by walking the floor before the guests arrived. Not to check tablecloths or centerpieces, though he did that too, but to look at faces, staff faces. Were they relaxed, tense, going through the motions? That's where culture lived. Not in training binders or mission statements, in faces. He'd learned that from watching Malcolm. Downstairs, the Gastroethica team had taken over one of the private dining rooms and converted it into an audit center. Malcolm sat at the head of the table, reviewing the preliminary findings. It wasn't good. 31 flagged customer incidents across 3 years, 14 staff complaints internally minimized or dismissed, multiple patterns of preferential seating based on perceived race, dress, and income. One training module titled Discretionary Hospitality Filtering, which was just a dressed-up phrase for profiling. Malcolm exhaled deeply and set down the report. "I built this," he said quietly. Margaret Chen, his chief compliance officer, replied without judgment. "You built the vision, but others built the walls around it." Malcolm nodded slowly. "Then we tear the walls down." At 4:45 p.m., just before dinner service, Malcolm gathered the staff in the dining room. Some were nervous, some still defensive, but all of them showed up. He stood at the center of the floor, no mic, no stage, just presence. "I know a lot of you have questions," he began, "about what's next, about what's expected, maybe even about whether it's worth staying here." No one spoke. "But let me make something clear," he said. "What happened last week wasn't about bad PR. It wasn't about one bad manager. It was about a system we allowed to grow in the shadows." He paused, letting that sink in. "You've probably seen me in the headlines, but I didn't come here as a CEO. I came here as a guest. I wore sneakers and a polo shirt and no name tag, and I was judged before I ever got to sit down." Heads lowered. "And if it can happen to me, imagine how many people we've turned away without even knowing it." There was a heavy silence. Malcolm looked around. "I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to see people with intention, with decency, without calculation." He nodded toward Javier. "You've already seen what leadership looks like when it comes from character." Some staff clapped. Most didn't. But more importantly, no one walked out. And that, Malcolm knew, was progress. Later that evening, Javier was clearing a glass when he overheard something at table 3. 2 middle-aged women were deep in conversation, one black, one white, both clearly regulars. "I wasn't going to come back," the black woman said. "After what I heard happened, I just thought, here we go again. You know?" The white woman nodded. "I don't blame you. But something feels different tonight. The way they greeted me, the way I wasn't scanned up and down. I didn't feel like I had to earn my seat." "You shouldn't have to." The black woman smiled softly. "I know, but I usually do." Javier swallowed hard and turned away. Not because he was uncomfortable, but because he felt proud in a way he hadn't before. Upstairs, Malcolm was in a video call with ESG partners from London and Toronto. They wanted answers. "We're receiving pressure from investor networks," one woman said flatly. 420 is frozen, Malcolm. What are you doing to restore confidence?" "I'm not here to restore confidence," Malcolm replied. "I'm here to restore ethics." They were silent for a beat. "Look," he said, leaning forward. "We've spent too long treating equality like it's a feature. It's not a feature, it's a foundation. If we get that wrong, nothing else matters. Not your margins, not your media strategy, not your Michelin star." One of the ESG directors leaned in. "So, what's the plan?" Malcolm didn't hesitate. "A mandatory certification." They blinked. "A what?" "Every restaurant, vendor, and partner who receives capital or sits under the Viridian umbrella will sign the Hospitality Rights Treaty. A binding ethics commitment, written by us, enforced by Gastroethica. And if they don't, they lose access to everything: funds, rankings, public endorsements, all of it." That same night, an email quietly went out to 418 partner restaurants. Subject line: Your continued participation with Viridian requires urgent review. Attached was a draft of the Hospitality Rights Treaty, with Malcolm's digital signature already at the bottom. Within 24 hours, 4 restaurants tried to protest. 3 of them were already under review for ethics concerns. By the next morning, 2 withdrew quietly. 1 was suspended. Meanwhile, something unexpected began happening at Lorraine. Guests started returning. Not because of some massive rebrand, not because of a PR push, but because word got around something had changed. Not the food, not the plating, the feel. There were still white tablecloths and crystal glasses, but there was also now eye contact, genuine greetings, laughter that didn't feel exclusive. People who never felt like the right kind of guest started walking in the door and staying. One night, a woman walked in alone. Late 60s, silver curls, pressed navy blazer and heels that had seen decades of Sunday church. She walked up to Javier and paused. "I read about this place in the paper," she said softly. Javier smiled. "Glad you came." "I didn't come for the food." He tilted his head. "No?" She leaned in, voice lower. "I came because my granddaughter works in hospitality. She's 22, and she's already tired, already invisible. I just wanted to see a place where that might change." Javier's voice caught for a second. Then he smiled again. "You're in the right place." He offered her a window seat, not because it was the best table, but because it was hers. Back upstairs, Malcolm received a short message from Margaret Chen. 72% of partners have signed the treaty, remaining 28% under review. Gastroethica Core dashboard updated. Malcolm didn't smile. He just closed the screen, sat back in his chair, and whispered to himself, "Now, we begin." The phones didn't stop ringing. Not with complaints, not with cancellations, with requests. Reservations from people who used to glance at Lorraine from the sidewalk, then keep walking. People who had read the headlines and thought, maybe now there's a table for me. It started slow. A church deacon and his wife from Goose Creek, a young couple celebrating their first wedding anniversary. He wore a mechanic's shirt with his name stitched into the chest. A single black mother and her teenage son, dressed up like prom night, ordering sparkling water and practicing which fork to use. No one turned them away. Not this time. Malcolm Reed watched the transformation from a corner booth. Not hidden, but not center stage either. He didn't need to be seen. He just needed to see. Across the dining room, Javier Morales was moving between tables like he'd been doing it for years, checking in with the new hostess, handling a mix-up in the wine order, pausing to compliment a nervous guest on her earrings. Malcolm saw it in the way the staff moved now, not out of fear, but from a new sense of purpose. Still, not everyone was celebrating. In a private group chat of legacy sommeliers, a message went out. Lorraine's gone soft. Next thing you know, they'll be letting walk-ins in flip-flops rate the foie gras. Another followed. Hospitality used to be aspirational. Now it's inclusive. Malcolm had seen the screenshots. Margaret Chen sent them to him with the subject line, "The old guard is cracking." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. That Friday night, Javier was prepping the floor when Malcolm waved him over. "You free for 5 minutes?" Javier nodded. "Of course." Malcolm led him to the back terrace, normally used for VIP tastings, but now empty except for 2 glasses of ginger ale on the table. Malcolm handed him one. "You've been doing good work." Javier smiled, a little nervous. "Still learning?" Malcolm nodded. "Good. Never stop." They stood in silence for a beat, watching the river lights flicker beyond the railing. Then Malcolm asked, "Do you know why I picked this city for the flagship?" Javier shook his head. "Because Charleston's honest," Malcolm said. "It doesn't hide its history. You walk these streets, and the stones still remember the weight of people who weren't allowed to sit at any table, let alone own one." He looked at Javier. "That weight, it still lives in the way people get greeted, in who gets the window seat, in who doesn't even get a menu." Javier nodded slowly. "And now," Malcolm continued, "we're writing a new kind of reservation list." Later that night, a familiar name popped up in the system: the Charleston Chamber of Hospitality Leadership. They requested a private table for 10, a formal dinner, hosted at Lorraine. Javier blinked. "You serious?" The receptionist nodded. "They said they want to understand the process." Malcolm approved it instantly, but not before calling in someone special. 3 nights later, the table was set. White linen, full silver, crystal glasses, perfect light, and 10 of the most powerful restaurateurs, hoteliers, and hospitality investors in the region sat down at Lorraine. Some had protested the Hospitality Rights Treaty. Some had grumbled about Malcolm's radical overcorrections. Now they were seated under his roof, sipping wine they didn't pick, and watching a service team they hadn't trained. Malcolm didn't greet them first. Javier did. He stood confidently, notes in hand, voice calm. "Welcome to Lorraine. Tonight's tasting menu is inspired by the people who have never seen their food heritage served on white plates." Some guests blinked. "Our opening dish is a reimagined oxtail consommé. Rooted in Gullah tradition, clarified for clarity, but not for erasure." The chef stepped out to nod. "This menu wasn't designed to impress," Javier continued. "It was designed to challenge." Then he smiled. "Enjoy." The room was quiet at first, but then something shifted. The food was extraordinary. The service, flawless. The storytelling, magnetic. By the 4th course, one of the elder board members leaned over and whispered, "This isn't a restaurant anymore. It's a reckoning in a dining room." Malcolm, now seated quietly at a back table, smiled to himself. Exactly. After dessert, molasses cake with sea salt whip and roasted peach syrup, Malcolm stood up. He addressed the table without ceremony. "Tonight wasn't about food," he said. "It was about ownership." Some guests looked confused. Not ownership of capital, but of history, of space, of narrative. He paused. "I built this place to show what dignity tastes like. And I don't mean high-end or fine dining. I mean the kind of dignity that says, you belong here before you prove anything, even if you wear sneakers." No one interrupted him. "You're not being asked to copy this," he continued. "You're being invited to remember why hospitality exists in the first place." He nodded. Not to make people feel lesser, but to remind them they're not. That night, 3 of the guests signed the Hospitality Rights Treaty. 2 more requested implementation audits the next morning. One sent an anonymous email saying, "I didn't know what I didn't know until now." The following week, the New York Times published a headline: "A black CEO walked into his own restaurant, got turned away, and changed the industry." They called it the Lorraine Standard. Other restaurants began requesting the treaty. By the end of the month, 23 signed. And it hadn't even launched publicly yet. Malcolm watched all of it from a quiet distance. No press tours, no media circuit. Just the slow, deliberate ripples of cultural shift. In Charleston, then Atlanta, then D.C. Back at Lorraine, Javier stood near the host stand one night when a young girl walked in, maybe 11, maybe 12, holding her grandfather's hand. She wore a simple dress, but her eyes sparkled. Javier knelt down. "Hi there, you joining us for dinner?" She nodded shyly. The grandfather leaned in. "She's starting culinary school one day, but tonight's her first real restaurant." Javier smiled wide. "Then let's make sure she remembers it for the rest of her life." He led them to a table by the window. No reservation, no prestige, just a promise that from now on, this table, every table, had room for everyone. It was supposed to be a soft evening. No major events, no high-profile guests. Just another Thursday night at Lorraine. The kind of shift where things flowed quietly, where the music sat just under conversation and the kitchen hummed like a well-tuned engine. But Malcolm Reed knew better than to trust calm. At 7:12 p.m., Javier checked the reservation log and froze. Senator Grant Whitfield, unexpected. Not on the list, not announced by his PR team. Just walked in. With his wife, their daughter, and 2 men in gray suits who scanned the room before sitting. Whitfield was known for his charm. He was also known for blocking the initial hospitality rights legislation at the state level just 2 years ago. Malcolm had never met him, but he'd read the transcripts of his speeches, calling the movement a feel-good PR stunt that weakens the standards of American excellence. Now here he was, at the epicenter of what he once ridiculed. Malcolm stood near the bar, arms crossed, watching the senator take in the dining room like he was inspecting a ship. Whitfield's wife smiled at Javier. Their daughter, no older than 17, whispered something about the glassware. The senator? He ordered a rare Bordeaux and called it a test. Javier glanced over to Malcolm, a silent question in his eyes. Malcolm nodded once. Let him taste it. The meal progressed quietly. Too quietly. By the 3rd course, a sea bass in ginger tamari glaze, Whitfield waved over the sommelier, loudly. "This fish tastes like politics," he said, just loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "Did you engineer this in a diversity lab, or does someone here actually know what seasoning means?" There was a pause. You could feel the air tighten, but the sommelier, a young Haitian man named René, kept his tone calm. "Our chef drew inspiration from Afro-Caribbean profiles, blended with Southern low-country flavor. Would you like me to have the kitchen prepare a classic alternative, sir?" Whitfield leaned back. "No. I like watching people pretend to know what they're doing." Malcolm stood up. As he walked over, every head in the room turned slightly, not in panic, but in curiosity. Guests had started to learn that when Malcolm Reed stood, something real was about to happen. He stopped at Whitfield's table. "Good evening, Senator. I'm Malcolm Reed." Whitfield looked up slowly, like he already knew. "I know who you are," he said. "I wanted to personally welcome you," Malcolm said. "I heard your comment about the fish. Just wanted to clarify. We don't engineer food here. We honor it, and the cultures it came from." The senator smirked. "So, now dinner comes with a lecture?" Malcolm smiled. "Only if the guest arrives thinking they're above the plate." The room went still. Whitfield's wife closed her eyes, embarrassed. His daughter looked down. One of the security men shifted in his chair, but Malcolm wasn't done. "I'm not here to embarrass you, Senator. You've already done that yourself. I'm here to make something clear. Dignity isn't seasonal, and it sure as hell isn't negotiable." Later that night, a video of the exchange appeared on a Charleston food blogger's Instagram. It was captioned, "When a U.S. senator insults your chef, and the black owner reminds him where he's standing." By midnight, it had 4.2 million views. By morning, it was on national news. 2 days later, Senator Whitfield's office issued a statement, calling Lorraine a valuable part of the community and expressing regret for any miscommunication. No apology, but everyone knew what it really was. Malcolm didn't respond publicly. He didn't need to. The dining room was booked solid for the next 3 weeks. But something else had happened too. That night, sitting in his office, Malcolm got a call from Amelia Torres, the director of a coalition of private equity groups backing dozens of hospitality ventures across the South. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "We saw the clip. That kind of public friction usually scares investors." Malcolm stayed silent. "But not this time," she said. "What you did, what that room witnessed, that's not a brand anymore. It's a movement." She paused. "And movements either change the market or take it." The next morning, Malcolm reviewed a financial report from his head of strategy. It was just 4 lines. Lorraine Group Portfolio Restaurants, 38 restaurants requesting treaty support. 56 hospitality rights treaty pending licenses, 73 ESG funds requesting alignment documentation, 14 groups, 930 almost in total assets. This wasn't a restaurant chain anymore. It was becoming an ethical dining infrastructure, and Lorraine had become the standard. Later that week, Malcolm called a closed-door meeting with the senior directors of his hospitality group. He laid out the new model. Every restaurant must adopt the Hospitality Rights Treaty. Every new hire will be trained in cultural access theory. Every chef must design at least one course that tells a cultural story. There was no vote, only a warning. "Anyone who sees this as a marketing trick," Malcolm said, "is free to resign today." No one moved. Javier, who had quietly slipped into the back of the meeting, felt something shift inside him. Not fear, not pride, resolve. He walked out of the room, pulled up a note he'd been writing for days, and sent it directly to Malcolm. "Sir, I've been thinking about Lorraine's expansion. What if we didn't just build more restaurants? What if we trained the next generation to run them? What if access wasn't something we offered, but something we equipped them to own?" Malcolm replied 5 minutes later. "Let's design the program." By the end of the month, Malcolm quietly registered the Reed Institute for Hospitality Equity, a nonprofit training center built on the same block where his mother once worked 2 shifts a day in a diner that wouldn't seat her boss for dinner. And he made Javier its first board member. Meanwhile, the walls of Lorraine began to change. Not just the people in the seats or the stories on the plates, but literal portraits. Where once hung oil paintings of French vineyards and old money estates now appeared. A photo of 2 teenage sisters in chef coats, smiling in their grandma's kitchen. A black father in a mechanic's uniform teaching his son how to fold a napkin. A Latina abuela writing recipes in cursive on a flour-stained notepad. Guests asked if they were famous. The staff always answered the same way. They are now. The room was silent except for the hum of the projector. On the wall in front of Malcolm and the board, a simple pie chart was breaking the restaurant world in half. 42%. That was the percentage of upscale restaurants in the Southeast found to have no formal anti-discrimination training, per the latest Ethics Core data poll. And now, that data had a name behind it. Malcolm Reed. Malcolm leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Let's not sugarcoat this. We all knew the numbers were bad, but this isn't about fixing one restaurant anymore. It's about whether this entire industry gets to hide behind tradition, or finally grows the hell up." Around the table, some nodded. A few squirmed, but no one challenged him. They couldn't, because at that moment, Malcolm held 2 weapons the industry feared most: the data and the funding. 3 weeks earlier, Malcolm had quietly launched the Code 21 Coalition, a private ethics alliance backed by Viridian Table Group, 3 global ESG funds, and a shadow network of impact investors tired of surface-level diversity pledges. What began as an internal protocol for Lorraine now had teeth, real ones. By aligning the Gastroethica Core with investment screening, Malcolm had created a kill switch for restaurants that failed their ethics audit. Fail the audit? Your ESG-backed capital? Frozen. Your insurance premiums? Tripled. Your partnership with premium distributors? Terminated. Your seat at global hospitality summits? Revoked. No public shaming, just quiet, surgical power. The first to fall was a prestigious bistro in Atlanta, Maison de Laurel, known for its $400 prefix and 0 black servers in 10 years. After failing their Code 21 audit, their reservations plummeted by 76% in 2 weeks. Then came the articles. Then came the investors pulling out. Then came the silence. By the end of the month, 6 more restaurants across 3 states were flagged. 3 voluntarily shut down. 2 fired executive teams and asked to recertify. 1 tried to sue. They lost. Inside Malcolm's office, Javier watched the flags go up on a digital map. Red dots where restaurants had gone non-compliant. Yellow dots meant pending. Blue dots meant certified. The map was growing darker. Javier glanced at Malcolm. "You ever worry we're moving too fast?" Malcolm didn't even look up. "I worry we waited too long." But it wasn't just restaurants watching. Hospitality law schools started inviting Malcolm to guest lecture. 3 airports reached out to see if Code 21 could apply to luxury lounges. A hotel chain in London asked for a private licensing deal. And most surprising, a French culinary institute, Le Domaine du Goût, sent an invitation, a formal one, to speak. In Paris, Malcolm read it twice. This was the same institution that once refused to host his mother's best friend because the South had no culinary lineage worth studying. And now they wanted him to speak on the future of inclusive gastronomy. He didn't smile, but his eyes lit with something sharper, legacy. Meanwhile, Javier had his own battle. The Reed Institute was 3 weeks from opening, and the building looked like a construction site that lost the war. Paint buckets, exposed wiring, back-ordered induction burners. Worse, half the team didn't understand the vision. They thought it was just culinary school with a splash of politics. It wasn't. It was a blueprint to rebuild access from scratch. One night, Javier stayed behind to organize the orientation packet. He stopped at the mission statement again, trying to find the right tone. He scrolled through the draft Malcolm had scribbled. "We're not here to teach people how to serve the table. We're here to teach them how to own it." He paused. That was it. That was the line. The next morning, Malcolm walked into the Institute's half-finished lecture hall and saw Javier standing in front of 20 folding chairs, coaching 2 interns on how to address trauma in hospitality culture. Malcolm said nothing for a moment. Then, "You're already leading. You know that, right?" Javier looked back surprised. "I'm still figuring it out." "Good," Malcolm said. "Leaders who think they've figured it all out scare me." By the end of that week, Reed Institute had enrolled 26 inaugural students, half from working-class communities, partnered with 3 legacy restaurants for apprentice placements, finalized a 6-month curriculum focused on ethics, food history, and power dynamics. Malcolm funded it in full, privately, and he made one rule clear: no one gets turned away for lack of money, ever. But the real surprise came when Malcolm received a package. Inside was a handwritten note on heavy cream paper. "I was wrong. I used to think dignity was earned through excellence. Now I realize excellence without ethics is just performance. Thank you for forcing us all to relearn what power actually means." Signed, Henri Desmoulins, the founder of Le Domaine du Goût. Enclosed was a copy of their revised global ethics standard. At the bottom, based on the Code 21 protocol. Malcolm walked to his window, holding the paper like it was heavier than gold. Outside, the restaurant buzzed with life. Families laughing, servers smiling, plates clinking. For once, it wasn't just about food. It was about who got to belong. Malcolm didn't usually attend ribbon cuttings. He didn't care for speeches, camera flashes, or fake grins from politicians who once ignored his calls. But this one was different. It wasn't a restaurant. It wasn't a press play. It was the opening day of the Reed Institute. The lobby still smelled faintly of paint. There were scuff marks on the new tile. One of the hall monitors had printed the room signs crooked. Malcolm loved it. "Means it's alive," he whispered to himself. Outside, a line had already formed. Students, parents, chefs, critics, funders, even a small crew from a local culinary high school hoping to just peek inside. Inside, Javier stood by the welcome desk, greeting every face, every hand. Malcolm stepped beside him. "You didn't sleep last night, did you?" Javier grinned. "Does coffee count?" Malcolm chuckled. "Only if it replaces blood." At 9:01 a.m., the doors opened. No ceremony, no confetti, just a soft chime as the first class walked in. There were 26 students in the inaugural cohort. Some wore brand new chef whites. Others wore thrifted shoes and borrowed backpacks. All of them carried stories that had never been invited into fine dining before. In the first ethics seminar, Malcolm stood at the front of the room. No slides, no microphone. He simply said, "In most schools, they'll tell you hospitality is about making people feel welcome, but we start with a different question. Why did they not feel welcome in the first place?" A girl in the third row teared up. A boy near the back took out a notebook and wrote that line down like scripture. Meanwhile, back at Lorraine, the reservation desk was overwhelmed. Not because of a new dish, not because of a celebrity visit, but because Forbes magazine had just published an article titled "The Quiet Revolution of Malcolm Reed and Why Every Luxury Brand Should Be Nervous." The piece detailed the financial freeze triggered by Code 21, how ESG investors were now favoring ethics-aligned restaurants, and most damningly, how some of the most famous names in American dining were about to be audited. In the article, one sentence stood out. Reed didn't just raise the bar, he turned it sideways until the industry saw itself in the reflection. Calls started coming in from New York, from Napa, from Sao Paulo. Some were congratulatory, most were panicked. One investor demanded that Malcolm slow it down before entire hospitality portfolios lost liquidity. He replied with 2 words: too late. By the end of that week, Code 21 went international. 3 French brasseries were downgraded. 2 Tokyo hospitality groups requested emergency certification. And a luxury hotel in Rome tried to preempt a public scandal by adopting the Reed standard overnight. Meanwhile, Malcolm kept his phone off. He was in classroom B, watching a young student teach the difference between service and servitude to her peers. She'd been a line cook in Mississippi. Now she was quoting bell hooks in a kitchen lab. Malcolm didn't need to be on a cover. He was looking at the future, in real time. At the end of the week, Javier knocked on Malcolm's office door with a small smile. "You might want to see this." He handed over a photo. It was taken from overhead, a wide shot of the institute's courtyard. In the center, every student, laughing, sharing snacks, mixing languages. Someone had painted a banner across the wall behind them. "We don't wait for a seat, we build the table." Malcolm stared at the photo for a long time. Then he leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and whispered, "Now we're just getting started." 2 months after the institute opened, Malcolm Reed stepped into the back garden of Lorraine for the first time since the day he was denied service. This time, there was no cold greeting, no manager calling him sir with a smirk, no hesitation in offering him a table. The maitre d' practically tripped over himself trying to greet him. "Mr. Reed, welcome back. Your usual table is ready." Malcolm smiled politely, then turned to his assistant, Simone. "Let's make it quick." Simone raised an eyebrow. "You sure? Thought this was closure." Malcolm exhaled slowly. "I already had closure. This is just a reminder." He didn't sit at the table. Instead, he walked to the bar where he'd been ignored months ago, leaned against it, and looked around. Everything looked polished. Better. Even the staff uniforms had changed. But Malcolm wasn't looking for visual change. He was listening for behavioral silence. The kind that told you whether respect had really been learned or just rehearsed. Simone ordered tea. Malcolm didn't touch anything. Instead, he quietly watched the staff interact with a family sitting nearby. 2 kids, a dad in paint-stained jeans, and a mom who looked nervous in the upscale setting. When their server approached, Malcolm watched closely. Would they offer the same service? Same eye contact? Same tone? To his quiet relief, they did. Back at the table, Simone showed him a tablet. "You've got requests from Milan, Seoul, and Sydney, all asking for licensing agreements on Code 21. That makes 37 countries total." Malcolm nodded. "Any pushback?" 2 investors pulled out, said we're overcorrecting the market. Malcolm didn't flinch. He'd heard worse from louder men with smaller ethics. That night, at a private industry roundtable hosted in New York, Malcolm was the final speaker. He wasn't introduced with fanfare. He walked to the front of the room with a glass of water and no slides. Just presence. He spoke slowly. "A lot of you ask how I moved so fast. The truth is, I didn't. We've been building this movement in silence, in kitchens, behind service doors, in side eyes and polite humiliation, for years. What you're seeing now is an acceleration. It's the backlog of suppressed dignity finally being processed." One chef asked from the audience, "Do you think every restaurant should be held to the Code 21 standard?" Malcolm didn't blink. "Only if you believe every human deserves to be treated with equal dignity when they walk through your doors." The next morning, he woke to a headline in Hospitality World. Malcolm Reed isn't reforming fine dining. He's rewriting it. And below it, a quote from a former executive of a now-defunct Michelin restaurant. "We built temples out of food, but we forgot who we were letting in," Reed reminded us. But not everyone was on board. An anonymous op-ed appeared days later, calling Malcolm's methods financial blackmail masquerading as justice. He didn't respond. Instead, he reposted it with one sentence. "If accountability feels like punishment, maybe you've been too comfortable." It went viral. Back in Atlanta, the Reed Institute had begun hosting monthly public dinners. They weren't profit-driven. They weren't exclusive. They were designed for storytelling. Each meal was curated by students, blending cultural heritage, community narratives, and ethical hospitality into one experience. The waiting list was now 6 months long. One night during one of those dinners, a young girl, no more than 11, stood up at the end and asked Malcolm, "Do you think I could own a restaurant too, even if I'm not rich?" Malcolm crouched down beside her. "You don't need to be rich to build something real. You just need to know you belong and never let anyone make you forget it." As she sat, Javier whispered from the side, "You know, that just changed her whole life, right?" Malcolm looked around at the table. People of every shade, age, and background, clinking glasses over a meal designed by students who had once been dismissed. And he finally smiled, deeply. "Yeah," he said. "But maybe she'll change ours too." It wasn't on a Forbes cover. It wasn't at a black tie gala. It wasn't even planned. The moment that would define everything Malcolm Reed had built happened quietly, over soup. It was a Thursday night at the Reed Institute. Rain was coming down in soft sheets, drumming on the windows. Students were gathered in the community kitchen, prepping for one of their new ethics dinners. No donors, no cameras. Just people. Javier had convinced Malcolm to stay and eat. "No excuses this time," he said. "You're not disappearing behind a spreadsheet." So Malcolm took a seat, third table from the back, just like everyone else. A student named Leah brought him his bowl. Thick lentil soup, spiced with cumin and ginger. Rustic, honest. "It's based on my grandmother's recipe," she said, a little shy. Malcolm lifted the spoon, tasted it, and paused. It wasn't just good. It was history in a bowl. Layers of migration, struggle, joy, survival, all simmered together. He looked up. "Leah, does she know you're doing this?" She smiled. She passed. "But I think she'd be proud." He nodded slowly, eyes soft. She'd be honored. At the end of the night, one of the younger students stood and cleared her throat. "I know we're supposed to learn about hospitality," she said nervously, "but I think what we're really learning is how to feed people's dignity." The room went silent. Then came the applause. Then came the tears. Even Malcolm blinked a little longer than usual. Later, when everyone had left, Malcolm stayed behind to wipe down tables. He always did. Javier watched him for a moment, then said, "You know this is working, right?" Malcolm looked around the quiet room, the empty bowls, the wiped chairs, the lingering scent of something more than food. He smiled. "It's not just working. It's finally beginning." By the end of that month, 14 other culinary schools had requested partnerships. 5 more restaurants adopted Code 21, and a small community college in Alabama launched a satellite Reed Ethics kitchen. But Malcolm wasn't chasing numbers anymore. He was feeding futures. One story, one student, one meal at a time. 3 months after the Lorraine incident, Malcolm found himself standing at a podium in Copenhagen, invited as a keynote speaker for the Global Ethics and Hospitality Summit. The room was full of investors, owners, regulators, chefs, and journalists from 28 countries. Some knew his name. Others only knew the wave he'd started. But everyone had read the same headline, the 420 freeze that changed the industry. Malcolm didn't open with numbers. He didn't open with titles. He opened with a question. What would your dining room look like if you couldn't see the price tag, but only the person? Silence. No slides. Just that. He waited. and then told the story, not of retaliation, but of reconstruction. He spoke about Leah's lentil soup and how her grandmother's recipe traveled farther than any Michelin chef ever had. He spoke about the young girl who asked if she could own a restaurant and how that question mattered more than any review. And he spoke finally about Code 21, not as a rule book, but as a reminder. Dignity is not a luxury, it's the baseline. And if your table can't offer that, it shouldn't be open. When he stepped off the stage, he wasn't met with thunderous applause. Instead, he was met with something quieter. Respect. Real, grounded, enduring. A French food critic who'd once dismissed his reforms walked over and offered a bow. Not dramatic, but sincere. "You've done what centuries of stars couldn't," the man said. "You reminded us this is a human business." The next morning, Malcolm flew back to Atlanta. No press waiting at the airport, no fanfare. Just a short drive to the Reed Institute, where 24 new students were huddled around a prep table, learning how to make dumplings, guided by a Korean grandmother from down the street. Javier greeted him at the door. "Guess what?" "What?" Malcolm asked. "We're out of chairs." Malcolm laughed. Good. That evening, Malcolm walked alone through the empty dining hall, brushing his fingers along the edge of each wooden chair. No cameras, no spreadsheets, no contracts, just the quiet hum of purpose. He sat down at the last table by the window, looked out into the garden, and whispered, "The table will remain open." Have you ever been quietly underestimated and chose not to shout, but to build instead? Tell us where you're watching from. And drop a if you believe respect should never depend on the clothes you wear or the seat you choose. And if you were in Malcolm's shoes, would you have walked away quietly or changed the whole table like he did? We read every comment. And trust us, your story might be the next Telltale.